AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota. Brett Johnson joining you on a Tuesday afternoon. And today we are with Patrick Coolican, who is the editor-in-chief of the Minnesota Reformer. Make sure you go to minnesotareformer.com for the best in Minnesota news and politics. As today we are going to be talking about, well, one of the big stories that has been in the news, and that has to do with all of the flooding we've been seeing around Minnesota. In several regions, we'll be talking about the potential for a special session to get some of those areas cleaned up. Plus, we will be talking about Minnesota corporations funding election deniers after many of those same companies said after January 6th, 2021, they would be reevaluating their giving to election deniers. Well, turns out that's not the case. They have gone right back to donating to those GOPers just like they had in the past. So a few good things to get to today, so let's get to it. Patrick, thanks so much for coming back on the show.
Always a pleasure.
Absolutely. So, as I just mentioned, over the past few weeks, Minnesota has experienced some very heavy rainfall, which has led to widespread flooding across the state, including areas in northeast Minnesota and now even in the southwestern portions of the state in Mankato, where if you happen to see some of those videos of that dam near Mankato flooding, it's not a good situation in several areas of our state. Well, the flooding has caught the attention of Minnesota politicians and legislators who are now pushing for a possible special session. Governor Walz even said that damage across the state could rival the 1997 Red River flooding that devastated many cities along the Minnesota-North Dakota border back in '97. So let's start off with probably the most important question when it comes to a special session, because there really only is one person who can call a special session, and that's Governor Tim Walz. So what are his thoughts about possibly calling a special session to deal with some of this devastating flooding we've been having around Minnesota?
Well, he has said in the last couple of days that he is open to it. There's concern about whether or not there's enough money in the disaster relief account, or whether the legislature needs to meet to put more money in it. And he raised that issue. And then also he said, well, while we're at it, we should maybe pass an infrastructure bill to shore up some of these systems that are failing due to the flood. I did ask House Speaker Melissa Hortman, and she would certainly need a sign off. She would need to sign off on any special session. Generally, the legislative leaders and the governor kind of come to an agreement before the special session. Otherwise, it can get kind of chaotic. And she seemed a little less certain. She told me that I think she's concerned about the amount of time it takes. She said that in 2012 there's flooding in Duluth in mid-June, and they didn't have a special session until August 24th. And so she told me that there's lots more info needs to be gathered at this early stage. And she also says that they put reforms in place, specifically Representative Gene Pulowski of that disaster contingency accountant, and they really hope that those reforms were designed to prevent the need for a special session every time there was any kind of a disaster. So the account is set to be filled again in the fall, and so maybe they don't need to meet. The special session politically, on the one hand, it gives the governor and the legislature a chance to be sort of in action and solving problems. On the other hand, there's going to be plenty of political grandstanding and long, windy speeches by Republicans, and it's an election year, and the lawmakers would probably rather be, some of them anyway, would rather be knocking doors and raising money rather than sitting in a hearing room or on the House or Senate floor listening to Republicans talk about how terrible the Democrats are. And as far as a governor going into a special session has all the leverage because, as you noted, he's the only one who can call it. Once the session starts, he loses all his leverage because only the legislature can adjourn. So it's kind of a risky move for a governor. He has to know that it's going to be well choreographed. The last thing governor wants is I mean, just in general, especially the longer they serve, governors don't particularly like legislatures. Doesn't even matter which party. When they're in town, they can only cause trouble. I mean, from the executive branch's point of view. So that would be something that they'll have to think about as they prepare for a special session. But again, they did put a law in place so that they to try to avoid the need for a special session every time there's some kind of disaster. We'll have to see if it's sufficient given the devastation of the flooding so far, and it's probably only going to get worse. We're probably just at the beginning of this. And here's an example. The Star Tribune is reporting as of an hour or two ago that manure pits have overflowed at 16 large feedlots in southern Minnesota, largely southwestern Minnesota, I think. So that has potential devastating consequences for the environment as well as human health. So I think we're just beginning to see some of the effects of this situation.
Yeah, a few different aspects I'd like to unpack with you, and I think you kind of answered my question, which is what sort of funding might be passed, because as you were saying, I was under the impression that, yeah, with what was passed a few years ago, they were trying to avoid this, but it sounds like if the devastation could be so great, it might even be above what the legislature had previously at least promised funding for these types of disasters. So that would possibly need to be even increased further. Is that something that they would have to look at financially, or I'm trying to think of the proper office that would have to look at how much money they have available for these types of disasters? So at least as I'm long-winded way of saying it, they need to figure out how much money they have available for these disasters and then potentially increase that fund. So that's essentially what they would be doing at this special session, correct?
Yeah, so there's about a little more than $26 million in that disaster account, and another $50 million will be transferred in August. Now the question is, is this disaster going to cost us more than $76 million? It seems likely to me, but I don't know. I'm not an insurance adjuster. And then we're also going to get help from the feds, likely, with a major disaster declaration. They did pass a law to prevent needing to come back to St. Paul, but I don't think might not be sufficient in this case.
I'm curious, too, as you had a chance to speak to the legislative leaders, that, of course, we do have a Democratic-controlled trifecta in this state, so at least I was thinking that possibly they might be more open to calling a special session, being that they would not have a session potentially hijacked by Republicans, being that the DFL holds the majority in both houses of the legislature and, of course, the governor's mansion as well. But it still sounds like, as you were kind of alluding to, that there always can be some tension between the governor and the legislature, even if they're part of the same party. So I was just surprised that there was some, at least maybe some trepidation on the parts of the legislatures and Governor Walz, being that they are from the same party, but it still sounds like maybe something could get done.
Well, we'll see. But certainly, Speaker Hortman. The subtext of which she wrote to me was that she's not convinced this is necessary, and it's not going to happen. Wouldn't happen right away. And the other thing to keep in mind here is that Senator Nicole Mitchell from Woodbury, who's still facing this felony burglary charge, and if they come back into session, there's going to be all hue and cry about that. And also, if you remember, the session that ended was not being run like a finely tuned machine. It ended kind of ugly, and so there may be some trepidation to come back to St. Paul because it's for those reasons, and also you just inject a lot of uncertainty into the political scene when you come back here, and not knowing how it's going to turn out.
And final question for you on this, and even though the Republicans are, of course, in the minority in both houses of the legislature, they have made some comments on what they would like to see done during a potential special session, including rolling back some rolling back some DFL bills that were passed earlier this year to try to get more funding for disaster. So let's talk about at least what the Republicans want from their angle and whether that's even realistic that any of what they're proposing could get potentially passed during a special session.
Yeah, I think that was mostly trolling that on their part, where they're saying like, okay, yeah, we should spend money to help people who are suffering after this disaster, and we should take it from the DFL's wasteful programs. I think that was the point they were trying to make. It's not particularly serious. It's not going to happen in a special session, but it does give you an indication of what a special session would be like. It'd be a lot of rhetoric like that. The other issue is, that could they get another swing at a infrastructure bill, which they failed to do in the session that just adjourned, and you could get a lot of kind of fake negotiating on the Republicans' part, and then walk away and say, well, the Democrats failed again to get you a good an infrastructure bill, even as the state is underwater. So I think a special session gives Republicans a pretty good political opportunity, and especially if you consider that they're outfunded. They don't have the resources that the Democrats do, and so this is a way to get a lot of free media, and during the kind of sleepy summer weeks before the state fair. When it can be hard to get Minnesotans focused, and they could maybe do so at least on the margins during a special session.
We can read more about the coverage of the flooding over at minnesotareformer.com and the potential for a special session over at minnesotareformer.com. I want to move on to one other story that you guys are working on, and this is one that has me not surprised whatsoever, and that is that Minnesota companies have been continuing to fund election deniers despite vowing not to, because after January 6th, many Minnesota businesses said they would pause political donations to review their giving strategies. Some went even further, saying they would not donate to candidates who supported Donald Trump's attempts to overturn the 2020 election. But lo and behold, here we are today, about 3.5 years later, and nearly all of these companies that made those promises have resumed giving money to politicians engaging in election denial. That's according to an analysis by the Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington. So, like I said, I'm not surprised by this whatsoever. When companies originally made this promise, to me, it was almost seemed like more a matter of time on when they would resume their donations. But let's talk about some of the highlights. Who are some of these companies that ended up donating to these election deniers after saying they wouldn't, and what might be some of the reasons for why they ended up backtracking on their promises originally?
Yeah, these are some of the most iconic Minnesota companies. Huge multi-billion-dollar mega corporations: United Health, Target, Best Buy, 3M, U.S. Bank, Ameriprise, Ecolab. I think there was a moment after January 6th where most of us were sort of united around the fact that this is deplorable, and he tried to overturn the election, and we're absolutely standing united against this. Then, of course, Trump managed to get the cult back on board, and it became a much more polarizing issue. And somehow January 6th, the definition of it and the meaning of it completely changed, at least in the eyes of many. And then also Republicans retained power in Washington, and so if these corporations, if they were to stand on principle, such as that, insofar as that's possible for a corporation, then they would lose measurably, and their shareholders would lose. I mean, in some ways, they would be acting irresponsibly vis-a-vis their shareholders. I mean, all these big companies have massive business in Washington, and really can't risk alienating one party in a two-party system. So from that standpoint, it's just a cold, hard calculation. All of them have really significant regulatory and tax issues they have to worry about. And then, I think there's unfortunately, it's true. It's become true in politics in the age of Trump, but it's even more true, it seems to me, in the corporate realm, where I'm just kind of speculating here, but you watch advertising, and all these products are going to make you happy and help you lose weight and all this, and it's just nonsense. And they don't seem to have any problem just saying it. And they say other things all the time. Their commitment to DEI or this or that, and then once it becomes problematic, they have no problem just cutting it away in the same way that if need be, they'll cut 10,000 employees. That's just the nature of the beast. So I'm not particularly surprised.
Well, it just seems like to me, too, that many of these corporations are taking the very short-term gain, which is, you kind of alluded to, trying to make sure you donate to both parties so you can still get favorable business tax codes or business bills that are being passed in Congress. But they're doing that in exchange for, a stable democracy. When you have one party that says we're not going to accept the results of the election, well, that leads to a very unstable society, which typically is not good for corporations. So I guess along those lines, too, I take it we're not really getting many comments for these companies. They probably just kind of want us to forget that they made those comments back in 2021 and just resume business as normal.
Well, that's the big question. Is authoritarianism, is fascism good for business? I mean, first of all, I don't really care because they're just terrible. But yeah, but if you're a business leader, I mean, I guess, this is the question you have to ask yourself. I hope that the answer is obvious, and then but more fundamentally, you ought to view yourself not as the corporate CEO of whatever company, but as a citizen, and do your duty. But in this environment, apparently, that's not how people think.
No, unfortunately, it is not. But you can read more about what Christopher Ingram wrote on this. Again, title of it is Minnesota Companies Fund Election Deniers Despite Vowing Not to. And you can take a look at some of those companies that made those promises, but then ended up going back on their word. But I should highlight one company that did keep their word, I believe, was General Mills, who, of course, makes Cheerios, among other things. They are one of those few companies.
Cheerios.
Yeah, good for Cheerios. They did. They kept their promise, one of the few corporations. So good on them, I guess. But you can read more about that over at minnesotareformer.com, minnesotareformer.com. We have been speaking with Patrick Coolican, who is the editor-in-chief of the Minnesota Reformer. I think I might have to go out and get some Cheerios now after the interview. But Patrick, thanks so much for coming back on the show. Appreciate it.
Always a pleasure.
All right, let's take a break and send things back over to Matt McNeil on AM 950.